All right, Wednesday, chapter 7, video number 3. I mentioned San Francisco. The thing I neglected to mention is that the main part of San Francisco, the epicenter of the Summer of Love movement, was the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood, the intersection of two streets, Haight, H-A-I-G-H-T, and Ashbury, A-S-H-B-U-R-Y. So, quite frankly, if you were a young person in 1967, it was June, and you made it out to the Monterey Pop Festival, it's entirely possible that you took some mushrooms, dropped some acid, hitched a ride to San Francisco, went straight to Haight-Ashbury, and hung around and waited for food and a couch. And probably wound up getting them. The level of violence and the level of community outrage over the Summer of Love was actually quite minor. It was a peaceful movement, and most of the permanent long-term residents of San Francisco were relatively supportive. So it wasn't a time of great distress. It was actually a time when, all things considered, my phone just fell on the floor. It's fine, I'll get it. Where mostly, all things considered, it was a good summer. All right, so we're on our list now, and Frank Zappa, an artist who over time would do lots of interesting stuff, a lot of experimental stuff, was never seemed anyway too concerned with commercial success or even critical success. Frankly, was more concerned about making art. His band, the Mothers of Invention, they put some interesting music together. So if you ever just want to go down the road of what did some late 60s specifically created art sound like, Frank Zappa and the Mothers of Invention. Andy Warhol was an artist, a painter from Pittsburgh, actually. And he was at the center in the late 60s of an artistic movement. He worked out of New York, and he brought together the creation. He brought together people that he found interesting. And they lived together or worked together, hung out together. The late 60s was a big time for communes. It was a big time for creating family, which for some people worked really well, but for other people destroyed a lot of elements of the nuclear family. So anyway, Andy Warhol brought people together. And one of the things that he did was he was a architect in creating a band called the Velvet Underground. Velvet Underground, which would go on to inspire and influence bands as, distinct from them as a lot of 90s music, in particular Pearl Jam, would come to sort of owe a nod to the Velvet Underground. Velvet Underground also had a singer on certain recordings of theirs named Nico, and one of the leaders of the Velvet Underground was a guy named Lou Reed, who would go on to his own critical commercial success as a real rock and roll icon for a few years. So on your list, take a listen to Sunday Morning. And then Heroin, another Velvet Underground track. Okay. Now, the next group of songs is pretty much about that Monterey Pop Festival that I mentioned in the last video. Monterey Pop Festival happened in June '67, really kicked off the Summer of Love, and it kicked off or propelled the careers of lots of folks. Jefferson Airplane were big beneficiaries. '67, huge year for Jefferson Airplane. Their lead singer, Grace Slick, to me, one of the pivotal women in rock music history. White Rabbit takes Alice in Wonderland references. This is psychedelic music, people. Mm-hmm. I've just been wanting to do that. Um, that goes with the lyrics, by the way, in case you weren't listening. Spotify, how many times? Uh, great, great music, Jefferson Airplane, Grace Slick. Somebody to Love, another great Jefferson Airplane song. Take a minute and listen to some of that. Great rock tune. Great song. I hope you're listening. The Who. Now, The Who was already a really big, very popular act in Britain. And although they'd gotten some traction in the United States, frankly, they were not really part of the British invasion here. And they paled in popularity and in influence, frankly, to the Beatles and the Stones. They were just sort of an also ran, but not in terms of quality, certainly not in terms of the music. It was just, there wasn't room on the charts for everybody. Additionally, if the Beatles were the good boys and the Rolling Stones were the bad boys, The Who was those guys down the street you just don't mess with. My Generation, The Who. I Can See for Miles, amazing song. Again, not psychedelic and yet psychedelic. Jimi Hendrix, still 55 years later, regarded as the greatest guitarist in rock history. There's a very small group, you know, um, Hendrix, Jimmy Page, Jeff Beck, Eric Clapton. Um, these are the guys who are, they're the club, man. But Hendrix is Hendrix is Hendrix. He stepped onto the stage at the Monterey Pop Festival, and quite frankly, everything just kind of shifted. He played there. He would play at Woodstock. He would close Woodstock very famously, as we'll talk about in later iterations of this experience. Um, and I picked for the list. I could have done different things. Hendrix was a guitar player. He did things with the guitar that people weren't unaware of that guitar could do. And in the same way that you remember, Muddy Waters brought amplification to rock and roll and really made it an electric art, Hendrix took that and just blew it out of the water in showing people what it could do. Take a listen to Purple Haze and Little Wing. Hendrix was spectacular. He would be taken from us way too soon. Victim of the Robert Johnson curse. He passed away at 27 in 1970. But at this point, he was on his way up, and Monterey Pop put him on the map. Yeah, where he still hasn't left. He still hasn't left. Next song on your list, Piece of My Heart by Big Brother and the Holding Company. Big Brother and the Holding Company was the backing band of a woman named Janis Joplin. And Janis would become simply one of the greatest female singers in rock history, one of the greatest singers in rock history. Talk about, if you have any doubt that the blues and rock and roll are bedfellows, all you got to do is spend about 30 seconds listening to Janis Joplin, and she's going to set you straight. Listen to My Heart. Hendrix and Joplin were icons of the late 60s. The irony that Janis Joplin would die just 3 weeks after Jimi Hendrix is not lost on anybody. Talk about the end of a decade when they passed on in 1970, Joplin from a heroin overdose. Again, just 3 weeks after Jimi Hendrix. It was the greatest 1-2 punch that rock and roll's ever endured. And the fact, quite frankly, that rock and roll survived that, it just shows the power of the art, man. It's crazy. Grateful Dead. I told you. Grateful Dead. They played a Monterey Pop, put Grateful Dead on the map. The funny thing about Grateful Dead and the map, they always kind of danced around each other. You know, I've got to hurry up. Grateful Dead, listen to Truckin'. All right, Grateful Dead, they're a long-standing group, and they're sort of cultishly followed. They're followed by people who come to be known under the vernacular of Deadheads. And they've never limited themselves. The thing about Grateful Dead is they've never limited themselves to one style of music. They play rock and roll, meaning they've done jazz, they've done experimental, they've done folk, they've done country, and they've done straight up rock and roll. They've done it all, they mesh it all together, and they make a sound that is uniquely theirs. Otis Redding, please listen to Otis. Please. I've been loving you too long, sitting on the dock of the bay. Astonishing. The Beatles, All You Need Is Love, great song from '67, and sort of summarizes the summer of love mentality. The Monkees, an American band that came around, well, 3 Americans and two Americans, 1 Brit and a Canadian, who came around, and they were created in a studio in an executive's office, frankly, had a TV show, and they released some records, including I'm a Believer, which you know from Shrek, but it was the biggest hit of their career. Pleasant Valley Sunday, this is a quiz question. Pleasant Valley Sunday was written by Carole King and Jerry Goffin, our old friends from the Brill Building. So I think, hang on, I'm going to look at the quiz really fast. Did I cover everything? I just want to make sure. Sitting on the dock of the bay, Otis Redding, he was killed in a plane crash. He was not 27, he was 28. Horrible, horrible, horrible. I did that. Check. See you in chapter 8.